welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thank you for joining me. If you don't really know this channel and you just suddenly found it, well, to explain, I release crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday every single week, consistently. So if you like crime and you do like things to be consistent, this is definitely the channel for you. Also, if you like very original content where you may know a crime but won't know the facts that I tell you about, this is also the channel for you, because I deep dive and also have access to a lot of things that a lot of people don't have access to because of my experience in this field, which means that hopefully I give you a really big 360 picture of the crimes that I cover, even crimes that you guys know about, and you guys know a lot about the crimes on the whole, even the ones that I do which are obscure, like today. Today's crime is one I'm hoping that you're not going to be that aware of, but let me know if you do. Also, big shout out to my Patreon fans. Thank you so much for contributing to help me make this content. It makes a massive difference to me. But as I say every single time, it blows my mind that you come back and watch, that you give me likes, that you write comments, that you get involved in my live chats. If you haven't been at a premiere on a Wednesday and Sunday, do come. My Kenny's Crime Cult is amazing. Best space on YouTube as far as I'm concerned, kindest space. So if you like getting involved with a bit of a chat about crime and also just supporting each other, then definitely join me for one of those. Merch is out, as you know, it's linked below. And also, if you've not subscribed yet, but you like crime and consistency, and you like what you see here today, then please take a moment to do so. It really helps me, and get your notifications on so you never miss a thing when I release it. Simple as that. Okay, well, today's crime, like I said, I'm imagining the criminal I talk about today isn't one that you all know about. So I'm looking at this from different angles. This isn't just about the crime itself and the things that played out. It's also about what I consider to be failures in the system. And the thing about failures is we're meant to learn from them, and with respect, I am not sure that we absolutely do. Let's just take, for example, a recent case of Colin Pitchfork, multiple child murderer who got released from prison. Shouldn't have happened. Anyway, he's gone back in for breaching his license. They should have sentences for child murderers that just last a lifetime, in my opinion. And likewise, there are other cases that represent this similar issue that I have. So the case I'm going to look at today is going to kind of deep dive into what I think could have been preventable things happening, and also just to expose some of those failures whilst talking about a reprehensible and dangerous criminal. So the individual that I'm going to talk about is Paul Glen. Now, Paul Glen was born in Blackpool in 1972. I will tell you that from the very get-go, this man was dangerous, he was violent. He had a real predilection for unnecessary aggression. So an individual who did not need provoking. He had a passion, I would say, for violence. He's been described as a professional killer. And even though I appreciate where that title comes from, I also would like for it to be known that when I think about professional killers, you tend to think about the movies where people are hit men or hit women, and you imagine that there is at least an ounce of intelligence within them. It doesn't actually feature in Paul Glen's world. Let's say he's not the sharpest tool in the box. However, I will also have it noted that the crimes I'm going to talk about today are the ones that we actually know happened. I don't think I understand the full extent of his crimes because I don't think he got caught for many of them. I am saying that when you look at the gravity of what he does and also the clear potential and willingness within that potential to carry out reprehensible actions, I believe he will have carried out many more violent actions than we will ever have him prosecuted for. We're going to talk about the two that we absolutely know occurred. But like I said, very likely that the extent of his offending history isn't actually thoroughly known. So, when did Glen's criminal life begin? Well, very early, actually. 21st of February 1989. He's 17 years of age at this point. 17. Let this sink in before I talk to you about what he did. So a 17-year-old Paul Glen and his friend, well, they have this big idea. They decide that they're going to rob £5,000 from a local guest house. Now, this home is owned by a man called Ivor Usher. And what Glen had heard on the street was that Ivor kept money in a safe. This wouldn't be unusual. This is Blackpool. Let's be real about this. Blackpool is full of guest houses, and certainly in the 80s, people were not as diligent financially as they are today. Most transactions today are done online, aren't they? They're bank transfers. I mean, it doesn't stop loads of people getting their life savings robbed by cyber expert criminals, but nonetheless, back in the day when I was a kid, you actually used to do things like cash up and take the money to the bank, just walking around with loads of wads with you. Not the safest thing to do, but this is how it was. And Ivor Usher, obviously because of his guest house, used to have cash around. So Glen hears about this and decides that he's going to take it from him. So the pair break in and they do overpower Ivor. Obviously it's 2-on-1, it's not difficult. At this point they decide to tie him to a chair, and we can all agree, okay, if it's a robbery, you don't want the person being predictable, you don't want that person being able to attack you. So to some degree there is a method and strategy in making sure that they can't move. So tying him to a chair is traumatizing for Ivor, but certainly also means that he can't cause them a problem, and hopefully will mean that he'll be safe. There'll be no need for violence, will there? Because at the end of the day, he can't move. But it feels as if Glen was an individual who actually wanted to do far more than just steal. Because that robbery, this going in to steal £5,000, quickly turns into something way more sinister. And it proves, as far as I'm concerned, to actually be a recurrent theme in the way that Glen commits violent crimes. So there is no need whatsoever for any violence in this situation. It is easy to extract money from somebody who feels overpowered, and it is very easy to go and rob a place where the victim is tied up. They can do nothing. No alarm can be sounded. So there is no requirement for any violence in this moment. But at some point, Glen completely loses control. And this 17-year-old basically bludgeons Ivor to death with a bar stool and a wrench. Now, in itself, when we introduce two weapons, we can see it's protracted. This is not about beating Ivor up. This is about ending Ivor's life. Because to get a bar stool, but then a wrench as well, you have lots of options to think about stopping, not going and selecting another weapon. So we're really seeing Glen's nature here, this tenacity and almost enjoyment of violence. Now, whether he absolutely always intended to kill Ivor, of course, is debatable. But with respect what I tell you about his future self later on in this video, I think will suggest that he probably always intended to do that. I'm not saying his friend who went with him to steal had any knowledge of that, had any inkling, but I believe that Glen wanted to kill. I think he has that thread running through him. There are people predators, aren't there? That's what psychopathic serial killers are. They literally look around the world and all they see is potential to exploit. And if they have a fantasy to play out, a desire to kill, well, they're going to do that. Now, one of the things that they realised when they'd killed this poor defenceless man, Ivor, is that they had to try to destroy the evidence. And the way that they do that is to set the building alight. Again, demonstrates a lack of sophistication. I appreciate that we all know that if you do actually manage to burn a whole building down and there is only charred remains, it's going to be more difficult to piece things together. But that's very rarely how things play out. And also, when people see smoke and fire, they alert the emergency services. So on the whole, unless it happens to be somewhere very abandoned, the chances are that setting fire will not actually make a difference to the body being found. And the body is found and the pair are really quickly arrested and charged with Ivor's murder. Now, bear in mind, when the courts make decisions around how long to sentence somebody to prison sentences, the point is they have to look at issues such as their previous experiences and also their age and so on and so forth. Glen was 17 at the time, so he's actually sentenced to life, but he's only served 13 years of that when he gets released. So I guess in places like America, everyone's like, what? What is this? Sentenced to life? Served 13 years? That is a driving offence, criminal conviction. You know, literally 13 years when you think about what this man had done is tiny, isn't it? So he's 17 when he carries out that reprehensible murder, and yet he's given a relatively light sentence. He gets paroled in 2002. Now, remember, to be released on licence, so to actually be given a licence to be free, the parole board have to be satisfied that you are no longer a threat to the public. The specific is you no longer pose a threat to the public, yeah? So bear that in mind, because that's important. Remember, parole boards, they're meant to be the people who can help us figure out whether somebody is entitled to be free again or whether they do bear a potential threat. I wonder if any of you can see where this is going. So obviously at this point in the video, I just need to say Glen gets out on licence, becomes a really great volunteer and serves our society beautifully, never has a problem again, end of story. Yeah, that never happens, does it? So 2 years later, 2 years later, after this guy has been in prison for 13 years for murder, in 2004, he basically has his services, shall we say, called on again. Now, at this point, he's living in Fleetwood, Lancashire, which actually isn't too far away from Blackpool, in fact. He gets the call basically because of a situation that is occurring for another family. So 45-year-old Robert Lotz, this is a man who lives in Farset, Cambridgeshire. He's a very affluent, successful builder. Well, this family and his family develop a feud with a particular individual that they believe are causing them issues. So Lotz believes that his 3 sons are being intimidated by this other person, a 30-year-old Vincent Smart. It was a long-standing dispute and it was causing the Lotz, as far as they were concerned, some psychological harm, in their opinion. Obviously, we only have them saying that that was the case. Now, according to what Lotz would later claim, he really wanted to let Smart know he wasn't standing for it anymore, that he didn't like the way he was impacting on his kids, and he wanted to make sure that the message was, shall we say, a stern one. So he wanted to scare him, basically to tell him, leave my children alone. So the way that he wanted to do this was to get him really badly beaten up. So weird when people are like that. It's like, we've got a long-running feud. How shall we solve this long-running feud? We shall solve it with violence. Oh, violence. Will that really solve the issue? You know, if there are some hostilities and bitterness and resentments between us, will beating them up make them feel, maybe they won't feel resentful and bitter anymore? But this is the way the mentality goes sometimes. So he basically wants to get somebody to rough up this guy. In that way, it will send a message and he'll leave the family alone. Also worth noting that this particular individual who wants to sort this situation out, as in get his sons protected, well, he's a millionaire, right? This guy, Lotz, is a millionaire. So you would think he'd have the pick of who he wishes to go for regarding getting this person roughed up, yeah? You don't want to do it on the cheap, do you? Doing it on the cheap can cause you a lot of hassle because obviously you pay for what you get, right? But no, he wants to do it on the cheap. What is it about very rich people? A lot of very rich people are very rich because they just don't spend a lot of money on things. In this case, Lotz probably made a very serious mistake. So he's obviously asking around about getting this situation sorted, and Lotz's brother-in-law, who's also his business partner, 45-year-old Wayne Wright, who comes from Hackney, he actually believes that he's got somebody potentially for the job. Apparently he's got underworld connections. Underworld connections. Whatever. Anyway, not the best, I would say, because one of the connections is 48-year-old Victor Dark of Waltham Cross, Hertfordshire. Now, even though this individual certainly is a dangerous criminal, he really is, and clearly he does have connections with Lotz's brother-in-law, The point is that he's probably not the kind of person that you want to get involved in per se, because he's previously been jailed for 4 armed robberies in 1980, which is one level dangerous kind of human being, second level really bad at what he does. It's just me. Like, if I'm gonna go, sorry, I just gotta say this, not that I am gonna put a hit out on anybody ever, I'm just saying, if I was going to put a hit out on somebody, the last person I would go and see is somebody who'd been imprisoned for 4 armed robberies, not 1, but 4, because chances are not very good at what they're doing. Yes, dangerous and violent, but not actually effective at carrying out a crime. Is it just me? I don't think it is just me. I think it's definitely them and bad choices. So this is what happens. Now, Dark, who's obviously been inside for these armed robberies, he has met Glen, our murderer, when he was serving time for kidnapping 3 people at gunpoint in 1989. So again, Dark has a lot of potential and is very problematic, and he's mixing with people like Glen, who we know is a violent killer. Now, Glen, at this moment, is obviously in prison for Ivor Usher's murder. And I guess that for Dark, that just made Glen the perfect candidate. Because firstly, he's got no connection to Cambridgeshire. And according to lots, it was agreed at this point that Glen would do a job for £300, which is insane. Because if we're going to think about Glen doing a job for £300, that is sinister. Because on one level, he's on licence. So that means that he's literally valuing his freedom at £300. Because if he gets caught for it, he's going to go back to prison. So the consequence of this momentary thinking is, all right, okay, I'll take 300 quid to go rough somebody up without any consequential thought about the impact of his life. Like, is he even afraid of going back to prison? We can argue that potentially not. Has he learned anything in prison? Clearly not. So at this point, it's agreed. Dark gives him the £300, and as far as Lots is concerned, this job is going to get carried out. However, let me draw your attention back to the beginning of this story. Glen is a man who's killed for money in the past. Now, later in court, the prosecution actually talk about a completely different version of events that played out. In fact, what the prosecution said was that the claim they felt was correct was that the men had actually arranged for Vincent Smart to be killed, not scared. So the prosecution said that the individuals who sorted out that hit were not interested in him getting roughed up. They were literally interested in him being executed. So that £300, the prosecution said, had actually just been a down payment. It was given to Glen to ensure that he went through with it, and then after he'd gone ahead and harmed this man, as in killed him, he'd get more. But we're not going to know the truth because obviously that was defended as well. Nonetheless, I think when we look at past behaviour impacting on future behaviour, then we can certainly say, well, it wouldn't be a difficult line to draw, would it? 8th of June 2004, this all starts to play out. So Glen travels from Liverpool to Smart's home in Farset, Cambridgeshire, to basically carry out the job. He is armed with a 12-inch kitchen knife. So instantly, my thoughts are drawn to the fact that if he were just going to beat somebody up, why on earth would he be carrying a knife? A 12-inch kitchen knife as well. You're going to inflict serious harm with that kind of instrument. So that in itself makes me question why Glen was going. Was he simply going to threaten somebody? Was he going to use the knife to threaten somebody? I suppose there is a potential there, but it feels very unlikely. Now, meanwhile, at the house where Glen is actually going to, on Main Street in Farset, 25-year-old builder Robert Bogle and his girlfriend Angelina Walker are basically making dinner. They're just preparing a bolognese, just having a completely ordinary night in. Simple as that. All they were thinking about when they were cooking that bolognese was how much they were looking forward to a quiet night in together. That was it. They were simply a couple hanging out, having food. Now, Robert's friend Vincent Smart, the intended victim, so he shares a house with Robert, well, he's away that evening. So basically he's house sitting at his parents'. Now let me tell you, if the universe and sliding doors moment in that situation is something of a protective mechanism, it certainly is for Vincent Smart, because he's away. And unfortunately, that sliding doors moment means that the person who isn't going to be lucky in this circumstance is Robert, a completely unintended victim. Now, when this crime plays out, there's a group of teenage girls in the street just outside, and they actually said that they saw this man approaching Robert's house and he stood out. There was just something about him, the determination in his walk, that they felt that he was an individual with a purpose. And they watched him as he walked around the back of the property. And then an elderly neighbour actually overhears what happens next. So they're in close proximity. So Robert and his girlfriend are in the kitchen, and literally from nowhere, the back door just gets kicked in, and then Glen bursts in. Just put yourself in that moment. You're just cooking your dinner, and this stranger from absolutely nowhere knocks your door down essentially, and then they're in that kitchen. And also at this moment in time, he's dressed in a hoodie and an overcoat. He's wearing gloves and he's brandishing the kitchen knife. So again, this doesn't sound like somebody coming to rough up a family, does it? This sounds like somebody far more sinister. I mean, the fear for that couple in that moment, the absolute confusion, the shock, the not understanding what is playing out. And this would happen in an instant. Robert didn't stand a chance. He's completely unarmed. He's taken completely by surprise. And Glen walked directly to Robert and just immediately attacked him. He stabbed him multiple times. Robert suffered loads of defense wounds to his hands and his arms. He was desperately trying to fend the attacker off, and then he was stabbed multiple times in his body. Also, he was stabbed in his cheek, and one of the strikes of the knife actually went through his chest and pierced his heart. In total, he suffered 10 stab wounds, and then Glen just turned and walked back out the door. That attack, from the moment that that door caved in to the moment that Robert lay mortally wounded, took less than a minute. Now, his girlfriend, of course, was completely panicked. She ran into the living room during the attack. She hid behind the sofa. She was absolutely terrified. She probably thought that she was going to get killed next, because this didn't make any sense. Now, despite the fact that Robert had the most horrific injuries, and they were utterly appalling injuries, somehow he managed to crawl and stagger outside onto the street. He's bleeding profusely. In fact, there was a trail of bloody handprints as he went. And the group of teenage girls that I was telling you about before, well, they're still in the street. And he starts shouting them to call an ambulance. He's desperate for help. And one of the girls actually dials 999 on a mobile. And at that point, he's still trying to get help. So he staggers towards a nearby shop. He's banging on the windows for help, and then he collapses. And passers-by absolutely stepped in, and they're trying to help him. They attempted to stem the blood flow to try to save him. Now, the girls, when they were questioned, they later told police about this man that they saw leave the house, and they said that he just calmly walked away down an adjacent alleyway. One of the girls would later tell the court that she felt scared by the large man, as she put it, so he was very intimidating. It was a very warm day, and she said one of the things that really stuck out was he was wearing gloves. And another of the girls actually said that when this was all playing out in front of her, she genuinely thought it was a joke, because she literally had seen this calm person walk away as he basically strolled past a scene of horror in the street. And I completely understand that. I think psychologically, when we're put in certain circumstances, our brain does a lot to protect us, doesn't it? And if you are literally watching what seems to be a horror show playing out, and one of the main characters within that just seems to be calmly walking away, it's almost easier for your brain to just say, this isn't real, this isn't happening, this is a joke. It's a way of not feeling totally overwhelmed and traumatized in that morning. It's incredible what our brain manages to do in those circumstances, to just try to make sense of something that makes no sense at all. Now, tragically, Robert doesn't survive. I imagine that most of you would know that because he'd been stabbed in the heart and he actually dies in hospital later on, which is just horrific. Now, just think about what I've told you in those moments. So, true to form, Glen, who's meant to be going apparently to rough this person up, has spectacularly deviated from the plan. I mean, according to lots, the agreement had been a clear to scare smart plan. But as I've said, Glen went armed with a knife. He clearly intended for something far worse. And we have to ask ourselves, was he signed up to that job with the knowledge that he was there to scare somebody, but he enjoys the idea of power and domination and killing, and he's looking for that excuse? If he can find a reason to go ahead and actually take that crime to the largest extent possible in snuffing out the life of an innocent person, he wants to do it. But he allows himself this dialogue potentially with himself that says it's okay because he's doing the job for somebody else. Almost as if, well, they've given me £300 to actually rough this person up, but if I kill this person, well, that will really prove what a man I am. But actually, the reality is he's just looking for an opportunity to murder somebody. Also, can we draw our attention to the fact that this guy didn't even check who he was meant to kill? Like, literally didn't even know who he was attacking. He just walked into that kitchen, stabbed a defenseless man to death, didn't even know that it was a case of mistaken identity. Glen hadn't even taken the time to ask Robert's name before he attacked him. Also, gonna bring a very obvious point here, Robert was a black man. Smart was a white man. He didn't even get the guy's ethnicity right. Now, considering that Glen probably intended to kill a man, isn't it weird, bizarre, and absolutely insane that he absolutely did no research into his actual target? He didn't even establish his ethnicity, which would have been enough for him to realise that he was going for the wrong man. Now, if what Lots and Wright claim is true, then Glen just did not agree to stick to the plan to scare Vincent Smart at all. Instead, he took it to a completely different level, and then on top of that, managed to target the wrong man per se. Now, following the killing, Glen flees back to his place of birth, Blackpool. You can imagine that for Cambridgeshire police, this is completely out of the ordinary. These kind of random home invasions and murders are so unusual that probably most constabularies have them once or twice a decade, if that. Probably less, if I'm honest. So Cambridgeshire police get into full swing. It's as simple as that. They start speaking to witnesses, and on the 18th of June, the police, through those witnesses, actually release an e-fit of the man that they want to question in connection with the murder. The killing, as far as they're concerned, just seems absolutely inexplicable. Genuinely, because obviously the police are going to do what they do forensically. They're going to determine the kind of character Robert was. He's ended up dead, stabbed to death in his kitchen. It seems to have been a situation that has some planning behind it. So what's going on in Robert's background that somebody wants him dead? And they do their checks. And literally, Robert had no enemies. And I'm not saying that lightly. Most of us have I've got enemies. My God, they're online all the time. Believe me, see it all the time. But the point is that even though I don't think I deserve them on the whole, you couldn't realistically say Emma doesn't have any enemies. In fact, if I end up dead, there'll probably be a list quite long that people will investigate because of what they've said about me online and so on and so forth. Robert isn't like this. Robert genuinely had no enemies. Now, for the police, it's completely unthinkable that some random man, therefore, is going to burst in and stab him to death. And his family were desperate for answers, absolutely desperate. They make an emotional appeal to the public for information. And his poor mum, Joyce, she said that she just needed answers. And in her words, she said, I cannot have him back, but I want to know the reason. I want to know why. Now, thankfully for her, to some degree, Glen does get apprehended. So to some degree, there are answers in the fact that clearly Robert wasn't the intended victim, and also he was somebody who certainly didn't have enemies who wanted him dead. That is not something that will make the loss any easier. In fact, probably more traumatic, on the basis that you realise your child was murdered for a completely incorrect reason. But at least she would also know that the truth about her son was out, that he was just this wonderful person who only deserved good things to happen, and some terrible, terrible twist of fate arrived at his death. So when Glen gets apprehended, it's because, as we know, not the brightest tool in the box. So they look at his phone records and they're able to establish pretty quickly his whereabouts at the time of the killing. They show he's in Farset. Those records also now indicate that he was in Blackpool. So police basically launch a manhunt there. Now, Robert's killing will be the first murder investigation tackled by Cambridgeshire's police's major investigation team. It's the first one that major investigation team from. On the 2nd of August 2004, so relatively quick time, Glen is arrested and charged with murder. Rightly so. Also charged with conspiracy to commit murder on account of the fact that he's planned the attacks, and he pleads not guilty to all counts. What? Not guilty to all counts. That's what he did. He's been caught bang to rights. They've got previous history. He's been in prison for murder. They've got him at the location. He's been described by people who actually saw him leaving the attack. But hey, why not go not guilty? I'm pretty sure that the defence barrister was like, okay, not sure how this one's going to work out, but let's just go with it. Also, of course, it's not just Glen who's involved in this, because there are other people who've created this situation. So the other guys involved in the planning are also apprehended. So Glen's phone records indicate that he'd been in contact with Robert Lott and his brother-in-law, Wayne Wright. So soon after Glen is arrested, Lott, Wright, and also a little bit after that, Victor Dark are all arrested, because they've all obviously been involved in this situation to some degree. So they're also all charged with murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Now, all three of those guys deny these charges. To some degree, I kind of get that. Glen should have just said guilty as hell, but the other guys, I do wonder whether they genuinely didn't think that this kind of crime was going to play out as it did. And certainly for somebody like Dark, who was the individual who introduced Glen, you can kind of see him thinking, okay, I'm definitely not an individual who wanted to see somebody get murdered. I just hooked these guys up with this situation. Nonetheless, these are all obviously very serious charges. So when the trial plays out, it's at Norwich Crown Court. It begins in June 2005. Now, the prosecution, well, they argue that Glen had been hired as a contract killer from the outset. So basically, they say that all of the people involved absolutely knew that Glen was going to murder the victim. So the reason they put forward for this is that Lott wanted Vincent Smart dead, and his brother-in-law Wright had the contacts in the form of Victor Dark, and that Dark knew a hitman, and as Dark knew a hitman who had indeed killed before, this meant that as far as they were concerned, they were hiring somebody who was more than willing to kill again. They considered Glen, as far as the prosecution was concerned, a professional killer. Again, he's definitely a killer. We all agree on that. I don't like putting the word professional killer in there. Not that I think anybody should be a professional killer. I'm just saying Glen isn't professional in any way, shape or form. Certainly hadn't had a profession either his entire life, but I digress. Anyway, prosecutor Rex Ted QC stated, in the dark, there are two mercenaries, Mr. Dark and Mr. Glen. And there are two customers, Lott and Wright. We say that the arrangement between these four was that Smart would be killed. So he argues that the £300 that was paid to Glen was basically a down payment from Victor Dark. The rest would be paid following the successful killing. Now, Wright, Lott and Dark, they all stick to absolutely the same story. They say The only thing that was meant to happen was that Smart was meant to be scared. They understood that violence was going to be used. Absolutely. They did organise for him to be beaten up, which is completely reprehensible and illegal. But it wasn't about ending his life. They didn't want Smart dead. Now, like I said, Glen said he was not guilty, didn't he? He's gone to court pleading his innocence. Even though it's bizarre that he did say he was not guilty, because if we just think about the fact that it's clear that he's guilty on the basis that, 1, he was seen doing it, 2, there was an e-fit that matched him, 3, his phone records were there, 4, his co-conspirators all say, you did it. And most importantly, let's be honest, Robert's girlfriend was present when it happened. Bang to rights, and yet for whatever reason, this guy is still maintaining his innocence. But if there is going to be some comedy in this scenario, he provides it to some degree in what he tells the court. Because like I said, not only do the phone records place him at the scene and the time of the murder, they've got loads of forensic evidence that link him to the crime. So they've actually found skin beneath Robert's fingernails. So that completely connects him and it matches Glen's DNA. And that's because Robert scratched him during the attack when he's trying to protect himself. However, as I said, it's hard to find comedy in any crime, but when it involves being able to highlight the stupidity of a criminal, I'm all for it. So let me do it for Glen, by Glen, using Glen and his version of events. So even though we all know he's an incompetent murderer, I do think we have to give a little bit of credit to the fact that he has a very vivid imagination. So this is how Glen says it happened. So he agrees, yes, I did go to the house on Main Street to scare Vincent Smart. I agree with that. Robert had apparently also been in the house, he agrees. However, he'd also arranged to meet a man called Steve there. Guys, just go with me. This is literally what he said. Because he planned to buy cannabis from him. Then, because he's a really peaceable guy, he planned to kind of have a smoke with Smart to simply talk things through. I'm going to give you a quote now that continues this madness through Glen's own words. I'm a sucker for a hard luck story. I don't like to hear of people being subjected to violence or bullying. I plan to take some cannabis around as a peace offering. If I could reason with the guy, I'd sit down and reason with him. I was a peacemaker. So he claims he met Steve at the house as planned. He was upstairs, basically just looking for Smart, to have that conversation. Returns downstairs and he sees Steve leaving through the back door and Robert was following him. Now, for some reason, he took hold of Robert to pull him back, no doubt attempting to explain why his skin was under his nails. And basically, Robert slips and falls backwards. And it's then that Glen noticed all the blood. And at this point, he just panics and runs from the house. Literally told that to a court of law. Now, unfortunately for Glen, and there are a series of unfortunate things that I think we all agree about Glen, his story doesn't stand up well to cross-examination. So what the prosecution point out at this point is that if Glen was not alone and Steve had indeed killed Robert, then why were there only one set of footprints matching Glen's size 10 Timberlands? In fact, Rex Ted QC, I do love that name, Rex Ted QC stated, this man, Steve, is not just a man with no surname, no address, no mobile phone. He is a man with no feet. You don't want to go against somebody like Red Text QC by making these kind of things up. They're very, very good at calling out BS. Also, remember, Robert's girlfriend, Angelina, is also in court giving evidence. She'd actually witnessed the whole horrific attack. The trauma that she was going through was absolutely awful. And with respect to her, she really struggled to give evidence. And I can imagine that we all have complete sympathy and empathy for her. Imagine seeing somebody that you love brutalized and murdered that way, and probably going through a period of time where in that moment you thought your life was under threat too. Now, there was a 5-week trial. The jury of 7 women and 5 men unanimously found Glen guilty of Robert's murder. Unanimously. Unsurprisingly. Now, he did avoid a further conviction for conspiracy to commit murder. So instead, he was basically found guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. His co-defendants, brothers-in-law Wright and Lotz, well, they were found not guilty of murder or conspiracy to commit murder. But the prosecution weren't able to persuade basically the jury that beyond reasonable doubt that they wanted to kill the target. So Wrights and Lotz, with respect, had already pleaded guilty to a lesser offence of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm at an earlier hearing, and Lotz got 4 years and Wright was given a 5-year sentence. Strangely though, Dark was actually found not guilty on all counts. He walked free from court, so he was the intermediary. He was basically the conduit that put the individual parties in touch, but they found him not guilty on all counts. Now, on the 29th of July 2005, Judge Sir John Blowfold sentenced Glen to a really rare full life term. So he got a full life, never to be free again. Also, they ruled that he served 9 years concurrently for conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. Don't think it was necessary, never getting out, but okay. It just kind of shows people the gravity of this individual's despicable behaviour. Now, this is where it kind of starts to upset me a little bit. Because bearing in mind the earlier conviction for murder, it really isn't surprising that he got a full life term, is it? But to some degree, it kind of is surprising that he only served 13 years for Ivor's murder in 1989. That's still considered a life sentence. So on one level, you've got a life sentence being given that is forever. You're going to die in prison. And on another side, you've got 13 years. I mean, even though you'd be on licence for the rest of your life, to some degree, was it reasonable that he only got that amount of time initially? And that's just one I'm putting out there. I think a lot of us will think it probably was quite a light sentence, and others, rightly so, will think, well, he was 17, so there was hope for him to change. Now, when you're on a licence, it is for the rest of your life when you've killed somebody. So even though you get out, you are still literally meant to be monitored. And if you break the conditions of that licence, you are taken back to prison. So clearly, the minute that he kills somebody else, he's broken the terms of his parole. And also, he's murdered twice for profit. Not a lot of profit, but nonetheless, you can see that his main motivation in that, to some degree, was getting paid for the violence. And also, again, we're going to have to highlight the fact that this is an individual who desperately likes to cause harm. He's gone out of his way, hasn't he, to put himself in those positions, and he's not bothered about the consequences. Now, the judge stated, as a result of your actions, a young man who had a future before him lost his life in circumstances which were terrible. Now, in September 2005, Glen's like, it's not fair. I mean, I've only murdered 2 people, given a chance by the parole board to get out after 13 years, promising to serve a sentence as a good human being in the community, and just completely blown it. But I think I should get a lesser sentence. So he appeals his sentence and it gets rejected. So the court are basically like, mate, it was justified and it was proportionate. You are going to die in prison. But the story doesn't end there. Stay with me a while, guys. This is one of those where you know about the murders, but there's more to talk about. And one of those things is on the 3rd of February 2007, Glen married 41-year-old Liverpudlian Paula Kelly. Paula, you and I need to have a conversation about your life choices. I mean, I appreciate maybe you're looking for a secure, committed relationship, and the way that you see that playing out is for the individual to never be allowed out of prison and for you to be behind glass potentially so that you never have to worry about any issues with commitment or safety. But Paula, there are better people available than homicidal murderers. I'm just saying. Paula, your family need to sit you down and have a conversation, sweetheart. Anyway, the ceremony takes place in a chapel at Whitemoor High Security Prison, Cambridgeshire. I know, it's the venue that most of us dream of. I mean, I suppose there's probably quite a lot of vacancies for all you do there, because I can't imagine many people are throwing themselves at people who are there for life because they've murdered innocent individuals. But who am I to judge? Who am I to judge? Also, the service is performed by a Catholic priest. Surely you would be conflicted in that moment. Surely there would be a point where you're like, I'm not sure that even being a Catholic priest is enough to allow me to go through with this. But I guess they believe in redemption and hope. And what harm can it do? This guy is never actually going to physically meet his wife in that way. So to some degree, service goes ahead. The bride and the groom have literally no contact. She actually spent the wedding night in a nearby hotel with her friends and family, who, if I was friends and family, should have been performing an intervention with her. We need to sit down and talk about your life choices. We need to give eHarmony or Tinder or whatever else is out there another go, because we're pretty sure that it is possible you can meet somebody slightly better than a double homicidal murderer. Just saying. Anyway, some people are a bit strange, aren't they? With respect. I could psychologically analyse her, but it's strange. It's odd behaviour. Also, because like I said, we're not ending yet, Glen's exploits don't end during that incarceration. So whilst he's in prison at Whitemoor, he gets involved with two other prisoners, and wow, let me tell you about these prisoners. So one is called David Bieber, no relation of Justin. That would be an incredible true crime story, wouldn't it? If I was like, David Bieber, cousin of Justin Bieber, also quite a good singer. No, none of that. David Bieber was a bad egg. And Keith Stewart, another bad egg. Just notice that I've used the words bad egg, and I'm like, not the most psychological, but you know what I mean. He was a bad egg. He wasn't a nice guy. Neither of these guys were nice guys, and they were hanging out with a guy who also wasn't a nice guy. So let me tell you a little bit about these. David Bieber was actually an American former drug dealer and bodybuilder. He's also a fugitive from the US because he was wanted in connection with a shooting of another bodybuilder and the attempted shooting of Bieber's girlfriend. So it was suspected that Bieber had actually hired the shooter. So when this had happened, and obviously the investigation led the services to him, he flees to the UK, and he did that using an identity of a child who died in 1975. On the 26th of December 2003, he's basically being arrested after driving a stolen car, and wow. If you think about what's happening when you get into trouble for TWOC, taking without owner's consent, obviously that's not good. You might get a prison sentence, you may not. But essentially, obviously, you're going to get into trouble. But think about the level of trouble that you're going to get into at this point. Bieber takes it to a completely extreme position. So whilst he's getting arrested for driving this stolen car, he shoots and he kills PC Ian Broadhurst. He shot him in the head at point blank range. That's after he'd shot him in the back. Total execution. Also, he actually attempts to kill PC Neil Roper and PC James Banks. I mean, the fact that these are officers just going about their work and they basically all nearly get murdered and one does whilst on duty is truly terrifying. And it gives you an insight into Bieber's mentality, because that is as psychopathic as it can be, isn't it? Now, he is originally sentenced to a full life term. I don't know why it was reduced to a minimum of 37 years on appeal, but it was. Also, if we think about Harper's Law, where PC Harper recently was horribly killed on duty, we now know that that wouldn't occur, and actually Bieber would be in prison for life. It's as simple as that, because when you kill somebody on duty, rightfully so, they are there to protect and serve, and the fact that you extinguish their life is reprehensible, but also additionally creates aggravating factors. They're just doing their job, and you are the chain of causation leading to them losing their life in that situation. Now, the other prisoner, Keith Stewart, well, he was serving a minimum 20-year term for the 1995 murder of an acquaintance of his, 25-year-old Terry Farrimond. Again, awful, awful crime. He basically stabbed the victim with a knife before he shoots him 3 times as he tries to escape. Also, the final shot, similarly to Bieber, he was very execution style, bullet to the head. And that killing took place not far from me at all, about 25 minutes away from me, residential area near Clifton in Greater Manchester. It took place just after midnight, in fact, when that killing occurred. Now, prior to his marriage to Paula, Glen, Bieber and Stewart had basically devised this escape plan. I do wonder whether part of the marriage plan was to actually try to carry out this particular belief that they could escape. So they get this escape plan together. They get a guest at the wedding ceremony to smuggle a gun into the prison chapel. How the hell does that happen? In a cake? Like they have in the cartoons? In a big hat? Somebody just carrying a big overcoat with them with said gun. But anyway, that's what they do. So their whole plan is to hold the prison guards hostage, then to negotiate the way out of prison and to get away in the prearranged getaway car. So they thought this out and they preempted the opportunity to get a gun. And on top of that, they kind of had an idea of how they would then remove themselves from the prison. We all kind of know that with the kind of violent tenacity all 3 of those individuals I've described to you have, it would likely have led to police officers and prison officers ending up dead. It's as simple as that. Anyway, they didn't get to carry out the escape plan because the prison authorities learned about it. It's one of those things in prison, isn't it? As much as obviously there is a proportion of the prison population who are very scary and very violent, the majority actually are not. And loose lips are things that others will pick up on. And actually, if you know that something really bad may happen to one of your prison guards, and bear in mind, a lot of prison guards have excellent relationships with inmates. They are not friends, but to some degree they are mentors and allies, and they're protective of them, and they end up working with them for years. So it makes sense that there is a level of community and care and compassion from prisoners to the actual individuals who look after them whilst they're inside. I know it's not perfect, and I'm sure there are people who fall out with each other as prison guards, etc. But I think for the most part, there is a harmony there. So the authorities are told about it. And Glen, Bieber and Stewart are all placed in solitary confinement, rightfully so, because they were planning something grand, dangerous and truly terrifying, that these minds that are meant to be being rehabilitated are actually just thinking about being vengeful and egotistical and only concerned with their own situation and ideal freedom from that situation. Now, following his release from prison, remember Robert Lotz, who's obviously gone down because he was involved in arranging the initial roughing up of Vincent, who ended up dead. Well, he hits the headlines again in 2011. The reason for this is he gets involved with 41-year-old Yvonne Cheney of Farset. So she has been in some really long-standing feud with a former friend. And basically, she'd really viciously assaulted her in 2009 when this girl was only 16 years of age. At this point, she's been given a community order. So even though she's done something very violent, she's not been incarcerated. However, she then scrawls all over her probation papers that she has a desire to kill said 16-year-old victim. So that in itself demonstrates that this woman, again, has got a tenacity for harm. And clearly, you don't want to be putting things like threats to kill on your probation papers. How are you doing? I'm fine, I'm fine. Could I just see your probation papers? Let's look at the plan of action. You're saying here that you're going to kill the victim that you assaulted? Yes. Yes, that's what I'm saying. I think we may have a problem here. Anyway, she knows, this woman, about Lott's involvement in Robert's 2004 murder. So she's aware that Lott's has basically had this kind of situation where, as far as she's concerned, there's been an arrangement to kill somebody. So she writes to him, and she actually offers him £5,000, saying that he knows anyone at all who will kill the teenage girl. She's willing to pay this money. And on top of that, she'll offer extra if any witnesses need to be taken care of. This is literally what happened. This is what it said. You will be paid £5,000 cash if, then has the name of the victim, the address, the description of the target as well, is disposed of. You'll be paid afterwards, plus extra cash bonus, if you have to dispose of anyone who may be with her. Thank you. Now, obviously, that's the only engagement that Lotz and her had. I'm not saying that Lotz actually was involved with her as a human being and knew her, but she knew of him enough to actually try to contact him this way. Now, thankfully, that letter never reached Lotz at all. It was handed to the police. And with respect, Lotz would not have done anything with it, would he? He would have probably handed it to the police as well. But nonetheless, you can see how when people carry out these kind of crimes or are involved with those kind of crimes, the ramifications are huge. Because here we have this deranged woman thinking that this is an option now for her to have somebody else disposed of because she believes that Lotz had the contacts to do that. Now, the letter wasn't signed, by the way. So when it's handed to the police, they have to kind of do some digging. So they basically speak to the intended victim, like, do you have any enemies? She's like, Cheney? I have an enemy called Cheney. So basically after 9 days after sending that letter, the police do arrest Cheney, and rightfully so. And they actually found her guilty of conspiracy to murder by a majority of 10-2 at Cambridge Crown Court. Now, the result of that was that she was given an indefinite hospital order. So clearly we were talking at that moment in time about somebody who seriously had mental health issues. When you get an indefinite hospital order, it's because they don't see you as a criminal, so to speak. They see you as potentially criminally insane, if that makes sense. So her insanity is leading to those kind of thoughts and actions, and hopefully that indefinite hospital order is one that's been proved useful for her mental stability. Now, if you think about what I've talked about today, Glen's case is a perfect example of the current failings in the UK criminal justice system. It really is. From the get-go, we've got this dangerous, ruthless killer, already been convicted of one murder, served 13 years, but reoffends literally 2 years after release. 2 years. And then that isn't even a mild offence. We're talking about another murder. Now, clearly Glen is a dangerous individual. He's got psychopathic traits. He also had the opportunity with those psychopathic traits to spend years in prison with people who had similar characters. Now, of course, he's paroled after the first murder, but it seems like, without a shadow of a doubt, he was exactly the same dangerous individual that he had always been. But now he's gone to crim school. You know, he's now a man who hasn't just spent 13 years inside. He has been honing his skills. He's got more underworld contacts. He has an opportunity now to fully deviate from a pro-social path. He has everything he needs, the people he needs around him for the choices that he ends up making. Now, historically, I will note that the British criminal justice system has mainly been punitive. So when you look back, it was very much about punishing, and it is very much about punishing. So basically there is this philosophy that says the offender gets convicted and sentenced as a punishment for the crime. Now, a lot of us will be like, amen to that. But what I'm going to talk through now is something that I think is important to get across, because there is clearly a problem with this system. And the reason that there is a problem is that often offenders are not rehabilitated. It's as simple as that. They are released and they reoffend. They return basically to their criminal lifestyle. Often, part of that is because it's all they know. Sometimes it's to do with funding of drugs and alcohol addictions. And also, it's to do with the fact that when you have a criminal record, it's very difficult to get a decent job due to that record. And the reason that I'm talking about this is I think that as a society, we have to ask ourselves question, because if all we ever do is what we've always done, then all we're going to get is what we've always got. So how do we address violent crime? Because on one level, it seems obvious, okay, send them to prison. But actually, statistically, there are arguments that seem to say that that's not exactly how it should play out, because it seems that more prisons aren't actually the answer to criminality. And I'll tell you why. So 47% of adults are reconvicted within 1 year of being released. Now, for petty offenders, that's offenders serving sentences of less than 12 months, this increases to 60%. That's for petty offenders. For children and young people in custody, the rate of reoffending is an unbelievable 75%. Now, I have worked with young offenders. I did over a decade working with young offenders. And you will know from some of the videos that I've done before, I take a hard line on crime, of course I do, but I am also very clear that my young offenders were often the most traumatized young people I had ever come across. They had been sexually abused, physically abused, neglected, emotionally attacked by their primary caregivers. They had been out of school from primary age, just left to roam and wander because they were difficult and challenging. They had needs that had never been met, learning issues that had never been resolved. They were essentially outside of society from a very early age, and the only way they knew to live was the way that they were living, because no one had ever given them a different opportunity. And by the time they got to me, they already had offences that meant that they were never going to be able to get the jobs that some of us would just think were obvious and easy to access because they just seemed like a career plan. These kids got blocked at the first hurdle because of that criminal offence. Those young people do not deserve to spend their lives paying for society's failures. And they are. It takes a village to raise a child is a saying I stand by. And we are failing that village. And this isn't me having a go at any of you guys. I know where your feelings are. I know your empathy. I know you understand that people who come from horrible backgrounds and end up doing horrible things deserve some sympathy and empathy as well. What I'm saying is this constant repetition of a system that is broken is getting us nowhere. And my experience of young offenders is, you know what? You give them a better place and a space, and a vast majority of them will stay there. Now, some won't. There are always going to be psychopaths. There are always going to be people with a tenacity for violence. There are always going to be con artists. There are always going to be sociopaths. It's as simple as that. And to some degree, we also have to acknowledge that sociopaths are often created by society. But for the vast majority of individuals who are given a better situation, well, on the whole, they want to stay there. So what I'm trying to say, and this is no excuse, by the way, to the case I've talked about today, I'm saying that prisons aren't working. They're not working. Yet, in the past 20 years, we have almost doubled our prison population. Doubled. It's increased 84% since 1990. That's from 44,975 prisoners to just under 83,000. And each one of those prisoners, on average, they cost us £41,000 a year. So basically, we are paying a really high economic and social price for a current failing system. And to be fair, that system is driven by political rhetoric and fear-mongering. It really is. So I believe truly that we do need to move away from incarceration and towards rehabilitation. And most importantly, what I believe is we need prevention. We need investment in education. We need investment in health. We need massive investment in drug and alcohol treatment programs, because we need to be preemptive, not reactive. And the current situation is reactive. And the current situation means that people die needlessly, or people have horrific experiences because criminals offend and reoffend and reoffend, because there is no way of catching them in a way where they can become better or have more. And so because of that, we constantly have these situations arising. Whereas if we get a root cause, which is in the childhood, in the parenting, in the addiction issues, if we really start working on those levels, we have a chance to make a change. Robert Bogle, he was such a loved son and brother. Just think about him for a minute, that poor man who got murdered. He was described by his family as someone who was always willing to help his friends with their problems, and they actually described him as being like a counsellor, a real mediator. Following Glen's trial, Robert's father, Linford, stated this: "It's been very difficult. My wife is only here in body. Her spirit has disappeared somewhere. We will never forget Robert." Now, in spite of what I've said about the need for redemption to some degree, the need to revisit what we're doing with a system that is clearly broken, horribly broken, and actually isn't making a difference, because remember, Glen, for example, got educated whilst he was inside. And of course, do I think he's the type of person who can be rehabilitated? No, I really don't. There are individuals just like him that exist. But for the most part, we can do so much more to prevent offending occurring. And even when early offending begins, like in childhood, as I've said, imagine that 75% of the time a young person who has been an offender once will offend again within that first year. That is where we need to be preventing these things happening, because it can and it will make a difference. That noted, somebody like Glen, I genuinely think, had evil running through his veins. I really do. I don't think it would have mattered who he'd been born to, where he'd been born. I just believe that he would have always had a propensity to kill. As I've said, there are always human predators amongst us. And personally, Glen fits that profile perfectly. And I'm glad that he will not walk the streets again. I question that he ever should have been given the opportunity to do so in the first place. And again, I draw the attention to the parole boards, who sometimes need to think a little bit more about the kind of individuals that they put back on the streets. Because Robert, he should never have died. Robert should have gone on to be the kind of human being that his family described for the rest of his life. Somebody who was good for our society, good for our community, good for his friends and family. I hope you found this one interesting. I hope you haven't felt lectured to. I'm not trying to, but I do want to bring the realities of our system into focus when I'm talking about crimes. I think that you come to this channel not just to hear about a story, but also to hear about how we need to change future stories. And that's why I've talked about the system and the statistics involved with that system. Let me know your thoughts. Maybe you just are happy for people to be rotting away in prison, and for you, you feel that they absolutely deserve that. That's completely acceptable. Maybe you feel that actually we do need a complete overhaul, and there are people in prison, let's say low-level drug dealers and shoplifters, who really don't need to be around individuals who are dangerous or create any more contacts with people that actually will only serve them to do more damage in the future. And maybe you're interested in what I said about young people. I hope that that in itself, that statistic, will get you thinking about the fact that maybe we need to rethink our young offenders system. Let me know. Give me a like, write a comment, subscribe if you haven't. I'd really appreciate that. If you like my merch, like this, loads more coming. All of the comments that you guys have made about the phrases and slogans that you want, they're all being created. So hang fire, they'll be here soon. Catch you next time. Hope you found this good to watch, and thanks as ever for your support. I appreciate you so much coming to this channel. See you soon. Take care.